Performance-Based Financial Aid. A conversation with Nate Johnson and Lashawn Richburg-Hayes. Background on MDRC's Opening Doors project.
Lashawn, I really appreciate your willingness to join this conversation. And I thought maybe, if you don't mind starting, I can ask you to describe a little bit what the Opening Doors project is, and which is the basis for a lot of what you found out about student incentives.
Absolutely. Well, first, let me thank you for inviting me to be part of this conversation. As you know, MDRC's mission, part of our mission, is to disseminate our findings to inform public policy. And that means all findings, good or bad, which helps in making better decisions, more efficient decisions, since resources are limited. We're known for doing experimental studies, very similar to clinical trials, but in the social sciences area. About a decade ago, we were approached by some state officials in Louisiana who were looking to use their TANF surplus funds to incentivize TANF-eligible clients to invest in human capital. MDRC up until that point had done a lot of work on using incentives to move recipients from welfare to work that had been fairly successful. And so the idea was to use a similar framework for a population of students who were TANF eligible, not necessarily TANF recipients, who would be interested in returning to community colleges. And that's really where the performance-based scholarship demonstration started.
Right. Just to interject here, Lashawn, the TANF is the state welfare block grants that states started to get after welfare reform that allowed them to allocate the money that used to go to welfare programs in pretty much any way that they want. Is that right?
That's right. Okay. That's right. And so Louisiana was taking a small portion of their funds to help clients who were not necessarily on welfare but eligible provide a more human capital development, which would hopefully result in their getting better jobs and being on a better trajectory.
The Opening Doors project in Louisiana.
So we did this study as part of our Opening Doors demonstration. Louisiana was one site of 4, but Louisiana was the only site that had this performance-based scholarship. The idea of the scholarship was to give students who in Louisiana were low-income parents the opportunity to earn $1,000 a semester for 2 semesters if they earned a C or better in 6 or more credits. It was a fairly generous program for Louisiana. At the point where we implemented the study in 2004, Louisiana did not have a state need-based aid program. They had a merit program. So if you were a low-income student who hadn't necessarily done well in school, or you were someone who graduated high school, was out in the workforce or raising your children for 5 or 10 years and therefore not eligible for the merit program, this was a source of funds that you could call upon if you met the income criteria, which basically meant that you were eligible for TANF. There were 3 non-negotiables that made up this intervention. First, the $1,000 had to be a net addition of financial aid, which meant that financial aid offices could not substitute out this additional money or supplant loans, etc. It really needed to be a net increase. If the student wanted to decline a loan in place of having the grant, that was fine, as long as the student made that decision. Second, the scholarships needed to be paid directly to students, which meant that the students needed to receive, in Louisiana, a check in their hand for the full amount of the scholarships. It could not be used to pay off past due fines or other debts to the institution. And finally, the monies had to be paid on top of any other financial aid. And so what we found in Louisiana was our sample was primarily low-income single mothers, that this scholarship encouraged many to enroll full-time, It encouraged them to continue enrolling each additional semester. And what was really sort of gratifying to us was that even though the scholarship itself was 2 semesters, a large proportion of students continued to enroll in the 3rd semester and the 4th semester for that small sample of students for which we have results. Unfortunately, Hurricane Katrina occurred in August 2005, and the areas where our students were located were among the worst hit. And so we stopped the study immediately and just dispersed the remainder of the funds to our students to help them in their time of hardship. But what we learned from the early findings of Louisiana is that it seemed to be a promising intervention to help non-traditional students succeed. In any study, there's always the question of what's really driving the results. Is it the target population, or is it the particular context of the institution or the context of the state? So, for example, it could be that you did any type of financial intervention in Louisiana and it would have given you similar results because there really wasn't anything there for the target group that we worked with. So that was a concern. Independent of whether the findings were very good or just modest, we would have wanted to replicate because the question of context is only answered if you replicate.
Before you go on to some of the other states, it seems like in Louisiana the salient features of the intervention that you may have some trouble disentangling, but that could be part of why it was effective, were the money, period, may have had some effect. The fact that it was given directly to the students instead of passed through the institution, that they received it in installments as opposed to in lump sums at the beginning of the term, and that it was the target population was specifically low income. Were they parents or just low income welfare eligible adults?
They were parents.
Okay, they were parents specifically, yeah.
And so you reminded me of a few more things that I hadn't mentioned. So you're absolutely right that they were played in increments, and that's really important because we were building off of some lessons we learned from other projects that in order to keep things very salient for people, it needs to be fairly frequent. The way financial aid typically works is a lot of it occurs in the background, and a student is not aware of what's going on. You may get a letter very early in the semester about your financial aid package, but you may not see anything else for quite some time. And so getting additional aid in that way doesn't necessarily affect your behavior because there isn't anything about it that's salient on a daily basis. In contrast,
did they actually get paper checks or direct deposits to their bank accounts, or how exactly did they receive the money?
That's a great question, and it leads to something else that I didn't mention earlier. In Louisiana, it literally was a check. It was a physical check. And
right.
What we also did there was another component, a counseling component, where a student was supposed to meet with their counselor several times during the semester, and at least 3 times because they retrieved their check from their counselor. So a counselor literally handed a student their check upon the student adhering and meeting the benchmarks.
Right.
The counseling that was done in practice was not similar to, or reflective of what was intended. What was intended was to have very social counseling, supportive counseling. Not necessarily, it wasn't geared to be academic counseling, but rather if a student presented with an issue such as domestic violence or homelessness, the counselor was envisioned to be able to comfort them and connect them with resources through the institution and other providers, sort of be the one-stop shop. And that part of the intervention didn't actually happen. But what did happen was students received their checks from their counselors. So there was at least one person who knew that student's name on campus. And that seemed to matter from what we heard from focus groups and interviews and our survey.
Louisiana's control group.
Did the students in the control group also receive the counseling, or were they just strictly left alone the way they would have been in the system before the intervention?
They were strictly left alone. So the control group experienced whatever the status quo was, and that what the status quo was actually varied on the two campuses that we worked with. One campus was, even though it was a community college at the time, it resembled more of a liberal arts college. So there were sort of stately buildings. There was a counselor on staff, an academic counselor, and so students, if they decided to be proactive and reach out, could actually receive some counseling. On the other campus we worked with, it was a vocational school, very limited in terms of administrative support, and there wasn't a counseling department at all. So for the control group, really what they had at that campus was the availability of faculty and some of the administrative staff, but not a person whose job was dedicated to provide advising.
Right. So I wish that there were better ways to untangle how some of the great ideas embodied in this project work together. I really like the idea, for example, of having an academic advisor hand a student a check after they've had a conversation about how the student's doing academically and otherwise, and that just seems like a great way to link an incentive to a behavior and a process that in itself seems beneficial.
Interpreting the data.
Aside from what you were able to figure out from this project, you mentioned some studies that maybe from other areas, behavioral economics types of things, maybe that may inform how you interpret these results.
Interestingly, we did a lot of things with the intervention that would be behaviorally construed to be behaviorally pertinent, but that wasn't exactly how we were thinking about it at the time. Let me give you an example. Notice that I said a performance-based scholarship. I could have called it a lottery, which would have been true. I could have called it a grant. I could have called it a contingent remuneration, which also would have been accurate. But we called it a performance-based scholarship. And I have to tell you, at least from my perspective, there wasn't a lot of thought put into that. But interestingly, what we heard from students, and students who were not necessarily good students in high school, some of whom actually dropped out of high school, earned their GED, had a few children and were coming back to the community college because they realized they needed to invest in skills, that getting this scholarship made them feel like a scholar. And we had students earning 4.0 GPAs going on to earn merit scholarships. And what's interesting about all of this is that some of it is purely a labeling effect. So it's about framing and brings in aspects of stereotype, threat, all related to behavioral economics that we were not aware of at the time we did this. So one of the lessons we've learned from Louisiana is to be very sort of aware of details. The big picture is important, but also pay a lot of attention to details. And what's in a name, it matters.
It seems like one of the other things about this scholarship and the others in opening doors, there was not there wasn't a GPA requirement beyond just passing the courses, right? It was more about completing a certain number of credit hours.
That's right. This was really a lottery, a grant. So students who were interested and met the eligibility criteria were randomly assigned to either be eligible to receive these payments or not. So it was not based on previous academic attainment. And if a student who was eligible for the scholarship, meaning a student who was randomly assigned to be part of the program group, actually didn't meet the benchmarks, that student would then continue to be eligible the next semester. So they didn't lose their scholarship. Traditional scholarships tend to work in such a way that if you fail to meet the criteria, you lose the scholarship. So in Louisiana, say you were randomly assigned in the fall, you're eligible for the $1,000 in the fall. The first payment basically was a giveaway. You earned it if you registered for 6 or more credits, so you received that increment. Say you did not earn a grade of C or better in your midterm, so you would not get the middle payment of $250. But say you really sort of worked hard and towards the end of the semester you managed to pass all of your courses with a grade of B. In that case, you would get the midterm payment that you missed as well as the end of term payment.
Okay.
Now, suppose another scenario, you continued to struggle, you withdrew from your classes, you did not earn a grade of C or better at the end of the term. Then you would have resulted in only having received the first payment. But in the spring, everything starts afresh, anew. You're still eligible for the $1,000 that spring. The same terms, you'll get a first payment based on enrollment, second based on midterms, third at the end. Most scholarship programs do not work that way. And so what this does in some ways is eliminate the risk from making a mistake. So compare that against, say, the Georgia Hope program, where you need to, it's a merit-based program, where you need to attain a certain GPA in order to continue to be eligible for your scholarship. If you miss the GPA benchmark, then your scholarship is eliminated. So that creates all types of negative consequences, sort of things that you would not necessarily anticipate, such as students taking easier courses, students being very strategic about courses they'll drop to keep their GPA up. You may even have a case of students changing their majors to easier majors so that they can maintain their GPA, so they can maintain their scholarship, et cetera. You wouldn't have any of those potentially negative consequences with the way the performance-based scholarship was structured.
Right. So I know that I worked at the University of Florida for a little while, and one of the studies that yielded those conclusions about the Hope Scholarship and the Bright Future Scholarship in Florida was actually done by the mechanical engineers at the University of Florida, who were concerned about the effect of the Big Merit Scholarship on the
STEM field,
the STEM pipeline, because of course it creates an incentive to keep your GPA up to avoid science and engineering courses, which often have lower average course grades, and so they did find, as you said, around the eligibility thresholds, a tendency to take easier courses and to withdraw from courses more often. So to take them and then drop them toward the end, and to take fewer courses. And so when we're in West Virginia, I think one of the interesting things that they did, they have a big merit scholarship program like that, but they structured it so that you have to complete 30 credits to remain eligible for the scholarship. So there still might be some incentives to take easier courses, but at least the problem of reducing your course load or withdrawing from a lot of courses, it may be a way of mitigating that consequence.
And so I think with all of these interventions, not just interventions that have an explicit incentive associated with it, but any intervention put in place, one of the things you really need to think about are unintended consequences, and structuring things in a way that you minimize that. It may be difficult to create a new intervention to help students be academically successful, without creating some unintended consequences. But to the extent that you can be aware of them, I think that's important.
Unintended consequences.
I just wanted to give you an example of some unintended consequences with an intervention that's not necessarily about the incentives. So we were working with a college to implement an intervention. And when we work with colleges, we really need to understand their processes for recruitment, because recruitment is notoriously difficult. And working with this particular college, we were told ahead of time that there were, I believe, about 4,000 students eligible for the intervention. We needed to recruit a sample of 1,000. So that seems like it should be fairly easy to do. But before we could even give away the money, what we ran into was there wasn't really an eligible population of 4,000 students. The eligible population was more like 1,000 students. And the reason was that the college had implemented a number of sort of small interventions to help students, but these small interventions were targeting many of the same students. So these were things like a student couldn't register if they owed a library book. That's reasonable. The library needs its books. A student couldn't register if they had failed to submit their high school transcript after taking 6 credits. A student couldn't register if they failed the math class twice. So now there were 7 of these sort of smaller interventions, and the practical effect was that it eliminated 3/4 of the eligible students from actually registering. And for the intervention we were working on, students needed to register before we could enroll them in the intervention.
That's huge. I mean, so those little things, the library holds and the
Absolutely.
Issues, really 3/4 of the students.
3/4. And so I really like to think about this as sort of the quintessential example of why you need to be vigilant about unintended consequences, because what may seem on the surface to be a brilliant idea often has spillover effects that you may not be aware of because you're not looking for them. And when you build an intervention, you're inevitably building one on top of something else. So you really need to be aware of what the something else is, because that's going to affect students. And so what ended up happening there was, instead of having a funnel of 4,000 leading to 1,000, we had a mushroom of 4,000 leading to 220. And what made this really interesting was our researchers from MDRC pointed this out to the institution. The institution had no idea.
Right. So they saw low retention rates.
Exactly.
But didn't realize how what some of the mechanisms were that were causing the problem.
Exactly.
So did they do anything about it, or?
So we managed to work with them for the study to get at least 4 of those restrictions removed, and then we managed to have some leeway for advisors to have more flexibility to make decisions about 2 more. There was a financial aid hold that remains in place, and that hold was actually pretty deleterious, in the sense that if you register to take a class and your financial aid came in and you didn't have enough to cover your tuition, if you didn't fill in and pay the gap, you'd be purged from the rolls. And since it was really hard to get classes, being purged was a pretty bad situation to fall in, especially if you took sort of all the precautions to register early in the first place to be assured to get the class you needed.
Right. So that affected students who, for one reason or another, had aid payments coming in late?
Well, it affected anyone who was unable to pay their term bill before the start of class.
Helping students manage their financial aid.
One issue that's come up in a few conversations with financial aid directors is this idea that we're dealing, well, with the Louisiana students, they might be a little older, but often it's, 18, 20, 22-year-olds, and they're living from paycheck to paycheck or aid check to aid check, and they get their financial aid payments, sometimes including money for living expenses as well as tuition, all at once at the beginning of the term, and they're expected to budget that over the course of the next 5 months. If you're going to give a student $5,000, is it better to give it to them in September or $1,000 a month, from September to January, or what do you think about the mechanics of that?
I definitely have some thoughts about that. And incidentally, we're actually working right now on a pilot called Aid Success, which is looking to take Pell Grant payments and instead of providing them as a lump sum, really providing them in increments. So instead of getting, as you mentioned, a $2,000 check, you would get that payment broken into, say, 6 installments instead. We've done this pilot in California. California, students who apply for financial aid and are eligible for the maximum Pell amount in California actually receive very large lump sum payments because of the low fee structure there. And
right.
We heard from students that having their aid check broken into increments actually helped them better manage both their money and their time. For example, we spoke to students who used the lump sum payment in ways that were not necessarily conducive to them continuing in school. So buying luxury purchases that seemed feasible because there was such a large amount of money, but then running into a situation for which they needed to increase their work hours towards the end of the semester, which is exactly the same time when you really need to increase your effort to study more. And so it worked well in the California college we worked with. And so at this point, we're working with other colleges in other states to see if it's feasible to implement using not only the Pell Grant but other institutional aid. But I'm a very big proponent of making things easier for students.
The importance of keeping students' circumstances in mind.
It astounds me how much we as practitioners and policymakers assume that students can bear when, in fact, we ourselves have many resources at our disposal to make things easier for us. It's very seldom that you'll meet someone in the public policy sphere, higher education sphere, that does not have a smartphone or does not have an integrated calendar, is unable to check email from the road. We see those things as necessities in order to do our work. However, we will expect the student to be able to check their email when they may lack internet access at home. They may have a prepaid phone without a data plan. But we don't necessarily think about these things when we implement policies. And so what that has is the effect of creating additional sort of taxes and stresses and overloads on students who already have a lot of things to juggle.
Right. So the simpler you can make it, and the more you can take some of these needs to remember things and respond to things and out of the hands of students and kind of make things happen for them, the better things are likely to go.
And if we can be very thoughtful about how we set up the process and alleviate some of the stresses and barriers that students will bear, we could actually help them be more successful. There are many, many ways to do this. When you just think about the registration process itself is very onerous at most community colleges and is not conducive to helping students. There are many reasons for that, but very seldom are the reasons student-focused.
Performance-based scholarships and credit requirements in other states.
I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the other projects that you've done. Do you want to talk about the ones you think are most helpful for policymakers to be aware of?
Sure. So we're working right now in 6 states, looking at variations of performance-based scholarships. So the variations have different components to the interventions, as well as different target groups and different scholarship amounts. In terms of the most relevant, I think they're very relevant for different questions. So I'll point out some features that will provide answers to some particular questions. So very early on, we started to talk a little bit about West Virginia's Promise program and thinking about the credit requirements associated with that program. So the research on the program found that having a credit minimum in place really induced students to be more likely to meet that minimum. Building on that idea, one of the sites in the performance-based scholarship demonstration, the New Mexico site, incorporates a credit benchmark. So the way that this intervention works at New Mexico, it is a 4-semester intervention, $1,000 per semester for 4 semesters. The University of New Mexico is an open access 4-year institution. So the target population is more traditional, students coming straight out of high school. Since the University of New Mexico administrators were really worried about students graduating on time, they structured the scholarship in such a way that it would induce people to take the number of credits that they really needed to graduate. So financial aid suggests that being full-time is 12 credits. However, in order to graduate on time, you usually need to take 15 credits or more. And most students think about full-time in terms of the financial aid sense, not the sense in terms of graduating on time. So, there's a discrepancy there that could really be fixed with just some choice decisions.
It seems to me that that's one of my hobby horses, because it on the one hand you hear people say that in student services that low-income students in particular can't manage more than 12 credits because they need to work or because they're struggling academically. I'm not sure there's that much evidence for that, and it also seems like it can be a self-fulfilling prophecy if you don't give students any additional aid if they take 15 credits. So whereas if you gave students who are taking 15 credits more than you gave students that are taking less, it would give them both the incentive and perhaps the resources to not have to work as much. So we seem to have created a culture of expectations where 12 credits, which was originally intended, I think, to be a minimum, has become a norm.
Absolutely.
And the other question I had about that is there are states that are looking at their financial aid programs and trying to put parameters around them and some limits. And there are a couple of ways to do that. One is to create a maximum amount of time or a maximum number of credit hours that the students can take and be eligible for state financial aid. And it's always seemed to me that it's a good idea in principle, but sometimes 120 credits or 4 or 5 years can seem a long ways off to a freshman. And what I like about the West Virginia intervention and what a couple of other states that have done is that it's a much more immediate kind of requirement. So it's not that if you don't reach your goal within 4 years, you'll lose your eligibility. This is what we expect to do right now. So, sign up for these courses, and that gets you to the same goal eventually. But adults, too, but especially I think younger adults respond very well to more immediate incentives than to something that's further away.
I completely agree, and that was some of the thinking that went into developing the intervention at the University of New Mexico. So the way the scholarship works there is that the first semester, the credit requirement is 12 credits. And the idea there was most people seem to think about that as the norm, as you mentioned, but there may be some adjustment to being at college, living on one's own in the first semester. But then for the remaining 3 semesters, the credit requirement increases to 15. And the idea there is these are traditional students. They may not be very savvy about thinking ahead, and you can essentially put them on a path to graduate on time by setting what the requirements are. So very much in line with what you just said. And we find that the impacts that we see from the program are really being generated in our early looks by this increased credit requirement. There's a larger proportion of students in the program group are taking 15 or more credits compared to those students in the control group, which after 2 semesters is already putting them on a greater trajectory to graduate on time. Right. And ironically, with potentially less debt because they're not going to stay longer.
Right. So even so in New Mexico, do they pay by the credit hour, or is there block tuition for full time between, say, 12 and 18?
So
credits?
they have a system for which it's essentially similar between whether you take 12 credits or 15 credits. So there's no incentive based on the financial aid to increase your credit hours. They also have, interestingly, a state lottery program that many students are eligible for who have attended New Mexico high schools that operates fairly similar to Georgia's program in that there's a 3.0 requirement, et cetera. And so when you think about the interactions of the incentives of these 2 interventions, it's quite interesting. There comes a point for which there's a little bit of a potential tension between the performance-based scholarships and the lottery program, in the sense that the performance-based scholarship, each semester starts afresh. So if you fail to make the performance requirements, the next semester starts anew. But with the lottery scholarship, if you don't meet the requirements, you lose it. And it's actually much more lucrative than the performance-based scholarship. So what could happen potentially is that you have a student that's incentivized to take 15 credits under the performance-based scholarship, but they need to maintain a 3.0 GPA under the lottery scholarship. So the tension could be, do I take this extra class or not? What do I risk losing if I don't make a 3.0 GPA, even though the performance-based scholarship GPA requirement is only 2.0?
You're not seeing that so far in New Mexico. That's a possibility, but
it's a possibility. It's too early to actually discern, because the only way that we'd really be able to get at it is to talk to students to understand their thought processes. We can look at the number of credits that are being attempted and the number of credits that are being earned, and we also know whether a student has the lottery scholarship or not. But what we don't necessarily get from the administrative data are the stories for those patterns.
Lessons for scaling.
So you've got the results from the 2 experiments we've talked about a little bit, as well as a number of others that are fairly closely related. Are there lessons from these that you think are applicable to programs at a larger scale? Either are there things that you would recommend that a state could do with its need-based aid program or merit-based aid program, or that an institution should think about doing with its financial aid resources beyond doing more experiments? Are there things that are ready to ready to be implemented at scale, or what would be your advice to state and institutional leaders?
Well, I think there are some things we do know. We do know that details matter. We do know that providing information doesn't seem to be enough. Providing structure helps. So most of our interventions that provide structure seems to result in programs, group students either taking the courses at greater rates or passing them at greater rates. But it's a better defined pathway as to what a student should do relative to the status quo, generally speaking. In terms of financial aid, I think we've learned that financial aid could be better targeted. So when we use proxies such as low income, there's still a lot of heterogeneity within that population. And so thinking about the students who are particularly at risk and working to target aid and support to those students, I think there's a lot of evidence to support that. Being realistic about outcomes, I think, is another lesson that we've learned, that many of the problems faced by low-income students tend to be complex and multifaceted, and to expect one intervention to address all of those issues is really unreasonable. So you are generally talking about comprehensive interventions, and so think about all of those interventions you have in place.
Right. Or when you're talking about the structure of a large state aid program, for example, is there enough evidence to suggest that aid be tied to certain behaviors or performance targets, whether it's completion of a certain number of credits or participation in certain academic support programs, or that the aid should be delivered in some manner other than a term-by-term lump sum? Would you have any suggestions for those kind of large policy issues where it may not be practical to do a whole lot at the detail level?
Mm-hmm. Well, first I wanted to just say that most aid programs are already contingent programs in some respect. So, for example, when you look at the Pell Grant, there already is a satisfactory academic progress provision requiring a grade of 2.0 or better. And most programs already have a contingency in place. So for large state programs, I would suggest looking at those criteria and understanding how they interact on a broad scale, and thinking about segmentation or targeting for the most at-risk students. And that doesn't necessarily mean you give the most at-risk students more aid. You can think about the distribution of the same amount of aid differently. So maybe the distribution is accompanied with counseling, or it's accompanied with the requirement to take a class where a student would get more support, say a college success course. There are many ways to be creative within our current resource limits without needing massive amounts of new monies to be effective. So I think pulling on some of the really exciting and intuitive findings from behavioral economics and psychology is important.
Closing thoughts on Pell Grants and counter incentives.
You mentioned some of the institutional policies, the New Mexico, the structure of the New Mexico merit-based aid program, perhaps providing a counter incentive to taking larger numbers of credits. Other than that, which is a pretty good example, are there other things you've run into?
Well, these are not things that we've run into per se, but in terms of institutional, of sort of broader state and federal policy not necessarily being helpful, I think a lot about the 2 Pell Grants in 1 year, which is a very interesting program, and really sort of supported some of the findings that we've come across in our work, that summer really matters as a semester. Most students don't take it up, but when you have incentives that induce students to attend during summer, they tend to do so, and it has longer lasting effects. It's cumulative.
Right.
And so my one point there is that rather than disband the program, it would have helped to understand whether there was a way to better target it. Perhaps it was too expensive to do it for everyone, but maybe there's a segment of students for which it would have really been helpful and affordable to provide summer support. So this is not to say that experimentation is needed for all policy decisions, but I think it's particularly a good lever to make decisions in an area of resource limitations. So when you really need to save and you're not quite sure how to go about it, having some evidence to back up what you're doing, or doing or exercising it on a smaller scale with a pilot or a small sample of schools, I think is a good use of resources and time.
Right. It seems too often that states implement policies that seem like a good idea but don't have a whole lot of follow-up in terms of evaluation and looking at both whether it had the intended effect and what the negative effects might have been.
Right. And you don't need to necessarily do this on a large scale.
Right.
But right now, when you think about the 2 Pell Grants in a year, what do we know at this point based on, compared to what we knew before the program? And I would say very little.
So it seems like one thing a state might do is to allow its state aid dollars to be distributed in some innovative or experimental way, perhaps at a subset of institutions to let them try something new and then evaluate afterwards whether that's something you might want to extend to the whole state. Just some flexibility to try different things and some good follow-up to look at the results.
Yes, and having talked to some financial aid directors, there are some good ideas out there. And when financial aid directors have some flexibility with institutional funds, they are experimenting. They're not experimenting in a way which would generate research evidence, but they are experimenting in a way that can inform their institutional policy. So I think having a formal waiver system and encouragement of this could really spread the knowledge of what works best for whom, and that's really what we need to know.
Well, maybe that's a good note to end on. I think we could talk a lot longer. I certainly have enjoyed it, and as I said, I am a fan of your work and hope that we can continue to collaborate and communicate.